I hope that we've kind of gotten our microphone problem solved. Kyle and Blake and did a little investigation, and hopefully they've got it solved. And this morning we won't have the up and down. I don't know how bad it bothers you here, because I'm standing here and not there, so I don't know. But I suppose if you were listening to it on the YouTube, it would really be a problem because you wouldn't be in the auditorium with the speaker, and therefore it would be a problem. So hopefully we've got it solved, and that'll make our broadcast of the sermons be better for those who are listening. If it doesn't, we've got one more option to consider, and we may have to go that way if it comes to it, but maybe this has solved the problem. I want to talk about something this morning that I've thought an awful lot about. It's something that I've started several times to speak on, and I haven't. And I've kind of pieced it together in my mind as to exactly where I want to go with it, and hopefully it'll be helpful and be beneficial to you. What I want to talk about is this. What is the purpose of our life? I think that's a question that is on a lot of people's minds. I really do. And I think that a lot of people reach some wrong conclusions, and they really misunderstand what the purpose of their life is, and it causes them to basically, as we sometimes use the expression, waste their lives. They waste it because they don't really understand what the purpose of it is. You know, there are a lot of things that have a purpose that we don't understand. We may possess something a long time and never really do with it what it can do because we don't know what it can do. And I think our life is kind of the same way. Now, let's think about this. There are two contrasting views. There's some who believe that their life, and this is a really dominant attitude in today's world. They believe that that we should live our lives for ourselves and for our own pleasure. And basically that comes from something that's happened in our country over the last, I'm not sure exactly how long, but I know I've repeated to you time and time and again. In the census that was taken in 1970, I believe I understood them to say that 80% of the people, or 70-something, almost 80% of the people in the United States, claim to be a member of some type of religious organization. The latest census that was taken in 2020, that number has dropped to below 40%. So that's a huge drop, that almost 40% less people have any connection with any kind of a religious organization at all. Now, what that suggests to you is that the teaching of evolution has been very, very successful. And what's happened is that people have been convinced that they will not live eternally, that they have no existence beyond the grave, that they are simply a highly developed animal, and consequently, there's no real purpose to life other than just whatever you want it to be and whatever you want to do with it. And I think that's kind of what's taken place. And I think a lot of people blind themselves when they start talking about all the social ills in our country. They blind themselves to the fact that the truth is, our real problem is we don't believe in God, we don't believe in eternity, we don't believe in any sense of having a system of rules that come from anything higher than human beings, so we just do whatever we please. And I think that's kind of what's taken place. Well, Paul described that. In Philippians chapter 3, beginning in verse 18, he said this. And I think it's an apt description of what you see today. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction. Notice the next line. Whose God is their belly. In other words, do whatever they please. And whose glory is their shame. When I look at people today who are just absolutely proclaiming how great someone is because they pretend to be a woman and they're a man. I understand what he's saying. They mind earthly things. They don't care a thing about God, and they don't care a thing about eternal life because they don't think it exists. You know, when you stop and you think about that, you realize that when you look around you and you talk with people, there are a lot of people that's the way they live. They don't care anything about their neighbor. They don't care about what pain their life causes anybody else. They're just going to do what they please, period. That's kind of the way it is. But you know, Solomon wrote a book. We've talked about this extensively. I've always had a fascination, and I've never hesitated to tell you that I do, with the book of Ecclesiastes. It fascinates me. Because Solomon wrote this book, and what he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes for was to prove that, in fact, that's not true. That's not the purpose of man. If you go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 7, beginning, he said this, talking about the end of our lives. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was. Our body is made of dust, and we live in an animal body. And it, like all animal bodies, will just go back to the dust. But the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. And then he says this, and it's really a summary of all the things he said, which we don't have the time to review. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. And what he's talking about is not your death. What he's talking about is everything that preceded it. What he's talking about is all the things that you did in life that you thought were the end-all, be-all, and they're not. You know, there's so many things been said about this over the years of how true it is. I don't know if you've ever been to Arlington or not. Arlington is a place that really, it bothers me to go there. 280-something thousand men and women who died in the service of their country buried there. That's a pretty amazing place. But there are two graves there that are given special emphasis. Those two graves are John F. Kennedy, and I believe his wife is also buried there as well. They are two of the wealthiest people ever to live on the earth. They're two people that, as far as things that this world could satisfy their desires, had everything they ever could have hoped for. You know how big their grave is, and you know what's in it? If you go over here, Berea is kind of a noted cemetery in this community, and some of you may not know it, but sometimes people die who really don't have any money, and they call the cemetery committee. It used to be this way, and I guess it still is, and you'd give them permission to bury them there, and they're buried there because they just simply can't afford to be buried anywhere else. And they don't really have any family there. They just end in the grave there, and that's the way it is. How big's that grave? Well, Nicky King and his crew dug that grave, and they'd dig a grave for the greatest and most fancy grave in the county. But in the end, what's in that grave is the body of a person who will eventually return to dust, and after some number of years, there'll be nothing there other than dust, and that's it. And it doesn't matter who they were, what they possessed, all the fun they had. None of that's going to make any difference. And that's why the wise man said this in verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, for fear God, keep His commandments, for this is the whole, King James says duty. Really not what it says. It says this is the whole of man. In other words, the only thing about man that has any lasting value is his spirit. And that's it. And it will continue eternally. Now, those two attitudes people have. We either just do what we please and think we're going to die and be dead all over like Rover, and we don't care, or we're going to serve God because we realize there's something after. When our body returns to the dust, there will be a spirit that's left, and it will be somewhere. Now let's think about this. When you think about purpose in life, Jesus actually addressed this question. He actually addressed it. And you need to consider the context in which He addressed it. In Matthew chapter 20, there were two of the disciples of Jesus who came to Jesus with their mother for the purpose of securing a favor, just a small favor. Let one of us be the first in command, or second in command in your kingdom. Let the other of us be third in command in your kingdom. So nobody's going to be over us but you. And so we're going to reign with you and we're going to govern. How do men who govern live? You ever look at how they live? You ever consider the things they do that you can't do because you can't afford it, but they do? You ever think about that? I heard them talking about yesterday when the President of the United States goes somewhere, there usually is 80 vehicles involved in that. 80. When you go somewhere, how many you take? Just think about it and you kind of realize what I'm saying. These men wanted something. Well, what did they want? Well, obviously, what they wanted was for them to be powerful and have basically anything they wish. So Jesus said to them, and if you begin in verse 26, he said in verse 25, rather, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. This is what you're asking for. But it shall not be so among you. Whosoever be great among you, let him be your minister, and whosoever be chief among you, let him be your servant. And then he used himself as an example. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. Now that's what Jesus said. What gives your life meaning and what makes your life fulfill the purpose for which God gave you is to be of service to other people. Now, that's what he said. Now, that service to other people sometimes we think of as being a public servant in the sense of a president or a local official, and that's really not what he meant. Jesus was never any of those things. He wasn't any of those things. He was a son who treated his parents well. He was a friend who treated his friends well. He was a member of a community that did what he could in the community. That's what he was. He wasn't a person that had what we commonly would call a public servant. Most public servants are really self-servants. It's what they really are. They're building themselves a power base and a position of grandeur. And that's what Jesus said in this passage. Paul noted that the same mind should be in all of us. That if you think about the purpose in your life, and people think, well, my life doesn't have any purpose. Well, maybe the problem is our philosophy is incorrect. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul said this, fulfill my joy that you be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord and of one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. Now, if you look back to John Kennedy, you remember it was he that stood on at his first inauguration and said that we ought not to think what your country can do for you, but think what you can do for your country. When we listen to modern politicians, they tell you exactly the opposite. Just, what do you think we ought to do for you? We'll give you a check. That's kind of the way it is. Total difference in philosophy there. Total difference in philosophy. One says you need to serve other people. One says, I'm the boss and I'm the one that's important and give me something. He said, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. You know, the purpose of this life, really, if you kind of boil it down, is kind of to leave it a better place than you found it. I don't know of a better way to put it than that. And I think the book of Ecclesiastes kind of lends credibility to that statement if you look to two passages. You can look at a lot, but we're just going to look at two. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, the inspired writer Solomon, he kind of talks about what we do in our life, and he said this, this is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely, and you notice what he said, by the way, riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. In other words, they view riches as something to make them more comfortable, like the rich man and Lazarus, and to make their life great and grand, and so they can enjoy everything, and they can have everything they ever wanted, and that's what they look at their life as. But he said, those riches perish by evil travail, and he begetteth a son, and there is nothing in his hand. As he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came, and shall take nothing of his labor, which he may carry in his hand. And this also is a sore evil, that in all points as he came, so shall he go. And what profit hath he that hath labored for the wind? All his days also he eateth in darkness, he hath much sorrow and wrath with much sickness. But then if you get down to chapter 7, verse 1, let me tell you what he says. What is to be desired? A good name is better than precious ointment. And then he says, and I've read this so many times at funerals, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. You know, when we die, we have written the book of our life. And if we have done things that have been a servant of many, then we have really kind of accomplished the purpose that we have. And if we hadn't, we hadn't. We've done nothing. Too many people don't understand that the purpose of life is not for you to have everything you want and you to just be comfortable and you to do whatever you please. It's not the purpose of this life. It's not. And the wise man says, in the end, the one who is the servant, he has something that endures. The one who is self-centered has nothing that endures. Now think about this. I thought about this, and this is what got me thinking about this in the first place, and got to thinking about preaching this lesson. I'm going to look at three people in the Old Testament. They're probably the three best-known characters in the Old Testament. Now, to bring it a little closer to home, before I do, let's remember this. Have you ever read a lot or studied much or even just watched the Sons of Liberty series on television that talks about the men who brought about the Revolutionary War and who gave us the nation that we're so thankful for? You ever thought about what it cost them? Some of them died. They never enjoyed it at all. One man was extremely wealthy and ended up a pauper because he used all of his wealth to secure the liberty of the nation. That's kind of common. People who really understand that there's something bigger than themselves. But I really want to go back to some that had to do with spiritual things. Not necessarily just physical things, but spiritual things. And I want to think about those. And this may be something you've never thought of. I really had never really given it thought in this particular way. You know, Abraham had three promises made to him. Everybody's familiar with them. It's in Genesis chapter 12. You remember the three promises. He was promised a land. He left his father's house. He went to possess a land that he had never seen before. He had promised a great nation, but he had no children until he was 100 years old. Well, he had one that kind of got out of line there a few years, I think 13 years earlier than that. But he only had one that was going to be his heir, and that one was born when he was 100 years old. And when you think about the third blessing, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through it, you look at what God said. God said, "Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." But he never possessed it. Do you know that? He bought one little parcel of land to bury his wife in. And he paid for it. And he himself was buried there. And that is the only possession of land that he ever had in the land that he lived his whole life striving to achieve. You ever think about that? When he died, best I can tell from reading the history, he had a son. But as best I can tell, he didn't seem to have any other heirs at that particular time. Maybe some. I'm not sure. Won't say that he didn't, but couldn't have been any more than 12 grandchildren. great-grandchildren involved in that. Don't know. But when you look at it and you think about it, there was no nation when he died. I mean, he was promised a land that he did not possess. He was promised a nation that did not materialize. And he was promised that he would bless all the nations of the earth. But that didn't happen until approximately about 2,500 years after he died. Now you think of that. Think of that. Everybody looks and they think of what a great man Abraham was. That's right. What you have as a member of the body of Christ, the seed of Abraham, you owe to the Lord and to Abraham, who fulfilled the will of the Lord, but he didn't have any of it. Never had it. None of it. And I think sometimes people kind of forget that. And so I think when you look to Hebrews 11, in verse 13, you know I'm not making it up. I'm not just making up something so that it sounds good. Because Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13 says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Now, who benefited from all the sacrifice that Abraham made? He did not. All the Jewish nation did, and you did as a Christian. He did not. Now, that's something you need to stop and think about. Because we think today about instant gratification. That's what we like. And we think that life doesn't have much purpose unless we can go on vacation 10 times a year and go live in the Caribbean or something like that. And that really makes us something. Well, the truth is, it's false. Now let's think about this one. Moses. Let's think about Moses. You know, Moses was a person that had an unlikely beginning. He was born at a time when every male child of his nation was to be cast into the river and drowned. But his mother didn't do it. And he eventually was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and had a great position. But he didn't count that to be that important, according to Hebrews chapter 11 as well. He didn't count that important. Affliction with the people of God. But let's kind of go back and let's look at what that meant. In Exodus chapter 3, beginning of verse 7, the Lord is talking to Moses, and here's what he says. I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of Israel is coming to me. And I've also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now therefore, talking to Moses, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And he did. Now he made some excuses, and God had to overrule him. But he did. And he went down to Egypt, place that he had fled because he's afraid he'd be killed. And he goes back not as the second in command, but as a person who's asking a favor, who's trying to get the Pharaoh to do something that from all physical appearances he was never going to do. And it took 10 major plagues for him to ever be convinced to do it. But now let's think about it a little bit. Moses was sent down there to get the people of Israel, who at that time prisoners in Egypt, to the land that had been promised to Abraham years earlier. But now he's going to bring them back, and he's going to put them in that land. But you know what? What's really interesting? He never went there. Do you know that? Moses never went there. He never stepped foot in that land. He wasn't born there. He was born in Egypt. He spent his time out in the Arabian desert before the Lord spoke to him. And then he went and he led these stubborn, rebellious people out of Egyptian bondage and brought them back, but not all the way. In chapter 33 of the book of Deuteronomy, verse 1 through 6. And this is the blessing wherewith Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. And he said, the Lord came from Sinai, rose up from Seir unto them, and sinned and shined forth from Paran, and he came with 10,000 of saints from his right hand, when a fiery law to them. Yea, he loved the people of his saints in the land, and they sat down at his feet. Moses commanded us to the law, even the inheritance of the law. And then he talks about the people and the tribes of Israel. But when he got there, I should have put verse 34 as well. But in chapter 34, he kind of summarizes it. This is what he did. Moses went down there as he was commanded, brought them out. But then in chapter 34, Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is over against, you notice this, Jericho. That was the place that the people of Israel entered into the land of Canaan. They entered through Jericho as the walls fell down. But Moses wasn't there. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead and Dan, Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim, and all the land that would be possessed. And when he showed it all to him, the Lord said unto him, this is the land which I swear unto Abraham. Abraham didn't get to own any of it except a place to be buried. Unto Isaac and Jacob. But both of them have since been buried. Jacob actually died in Egypt. Saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes. But thou shalt not go over hither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. Now you think about it. I mean, he is one of the three most famous people in the Old Testament because he led the people of Israel out of Egypt to the land of Canaan. But for all of his efforts of 40 years leading a stubborn and rebellious people in the wilderness, he wasn't even granted permission to set his foot on any of that ground. Never did. Not a single time did he ever possess any of it. Now, you say, you know, I hear people say something today. There are two expressions I get tired of hearing. One is when people say it's not fair. I don't like that expression at all. Because if I looked at Abraham and Moses, I'd say, man, that's not fair. How's that fair? I've heard some people explain it this way. Life is not fair. That's pretty much the truth. It's a matter of chance. Whichever side you end up on. It's kind of the way it is sometimes. Moses didn't enter the promised land because he sinned. But let's look at the last one. David. If you think of the Old Testament, Abraham, Moses, and David are probably, I would think almost without question, the three most popular, best-known characters of the Old Testament. We don't have time to review all of David's life. David was appointed king at 17. Didn't become king till he was 30. And a lot of things happened in those years that weren't very pleasant. But David had a dream. And it would seem that the Lord concurred with that dream to a certain degree. In 1 Kings chapter 5, you're talking about Solomon. And he's building a temple. And it said, Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants unto Solomon, for he had heard that they had anointed him king in the room of his father, for Hiram was ever a lover of David. He and David were very close allies. And so he's sending help to Solomon. What do you need? Here's what Solomon said. Solomon sent to Hiram, saying, Thou knowest how that David my father could not build an house under the name of the Lord his God for the wars which are about him. God actually said he wouldn't let him build it because he was a man of blood, which were about him on every side, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. And now the Lord my God hath given me rest on every side, so that there is neither adversary nor evil occurrent. And behold, I propose to build an house unto the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spake unto David my father, saying, Thy son, whom I will set upon the throne in thy room, he shall build an house unto my name. Best I can tell, that was really the lifelong dream that David had. Build a temple in Jerusalem to replace that temporary tabernacle that was over at Bethel. Something that shows some stability, that God has revealed is going to be done. And best I can tell, David spent a lot of time thinking about that, probably in gathering up materials, best I can also see from the Old Testament. But when David died, there was no temple in Jerusalem. Now, you know what that means? That means if you look at the three most popular, best-known characters of the Old Testament, Abraham, Moses, and David, the things that they are most noted for, they did not personally do. You ever think about that? They didn't. They didn't personally do them. You look at the three things that they're the most noted for. There wasn't a nation of Israel until about 1,000 years after Abraham died. Not a real nation. There wasn't a spiritual blessing until about 2,500 years after he died through Christ. You think of that. And you look at David and that temple that he was so devoted to building. It wasn't built in his lifetime. He didn't do it. He was dead and buried when it was accomplished. And you look at Moses and all the effort he went through. He himself was not permitted to even step his foot on the ground on the other side of the Jordan River. Now, that's interesting. So let me ask you a question. You think about it a moment. Was there any purpose to their life? Because none of them actually accomplished what they so dreamed of doing. You know, you stop and you think about that and you kind of realize something. If Abraham hadn't kept his end of the bargain, would there have been a nation? Would there have been the great blessing? The answer is no. So he was very important. If Moses had not led the people to the Jordan and then appointed Joshua as the leader, would they have ever entered the land? Well, God may have chosen some other method. I'm not saying that. But in the plan that was chosen then, he was an integral part and very important. When David had such an interest in building the temple and established this, and if you go back and study it, this Hiram was very influential. He furnished almost all the lumber for that thing. And the more you see about it, he furnished all the craftsmen to a great extent. And you see that that was based on David's relationship, not Solomon's. You kind of understand what I'm saying? We look at purpose in life just glorifying us and how great we are, but none of these persons in their lifetime had any glory for any of these things. So then you begin to think. You begin to understand what Jesus meant. Because after all, if you go back and consider it, and you think about Jesus, Isaiah 53 informs us that Jesus was not a very attractive man. That's what it says, basically. He wasn't a man to be desired. Wasn't like Saul, that just such a handsome, tall, dark, handsome guy, everybody just fell down at his feet. Didn't happen. When you look at Jesus, he wasn't wealthy, powerful, and influential. He was not. When you look at Jesus, he was a person that said himself that he did not have a place to lay his head. He was a person that when he died, everybody around him became so disenchanted they deserted him. And even when they got them all back together, had about 125, I believe, left there. So what you're seeing when you look at that is you realize that what Jesus said is so extremely important. What are we as Christians interested in? Well, I'm going to tell you something. If we're not interested in pleasing God and being saved eternally, wasting our time, that's the purpose of your life. That's the purpose of it. Why? How do I know that? Because when this life is over, whoever you are, whatever you possess, whatever things you enjoyed, won't amount to a hill of beans. The only thing that will make any difference at that particular time is whether or not God says to you, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." That's it. So you think about the purpose of your life and give that some consideration. Tonight, we're going to take this a little bit further. And if you're back, we're going to talk about what can I do. I think this is a common thing that people say. When they look at their life, they don't think they're very important. They don't think there's much they can do. They don't think it really matters much. We're going to talk a little about that. And we're going to base it on Galatians 6, verse 9 and 10. You know what that says? That says we need to realize that what it all boils down to when you ask the question, what can I do, is doing what you can. You know, instead of that saying, what can I do, we should say, I will do what I can. This passage says, let us not be weary in well-doing. Now, did you do the things like Abraham did? No, probably not. What about like Moses did? Probably not. What about like David? Is anybody going to write books about you in the future of all these things? Probably not. But here's what he does say. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially those that are of the household of faith. Now you think about that, and that tells you that this is custom fitted to every person who draws a breath on this earth. May not be Abraham, may not be Moses, may not be David, may not be Jesus, may not be the Apostle Paul, may not be the Apostle Peter, but every human being can have some purpose to their life. So we're going to think a little about that. You know, we've talked about things that are important. The only real thing that's important about life is whether we'll obey God or not. Whatever the social circumstances that dictate where we live and what kind of job we have and all that. And there's a lot of things that have to do with that we don't control at all. But the one thing that we do have control over, and the only thing that really matters in the long run anyway, is whether we please God, whether we serve Him, whether we don't. That's it. That's the only thing that has any real value in the end. You need to sometimes sit down and make a thorough reading of the book of Ecclesiastes, because he goes down the list of everything that man considers important and makes us a successful person, and tells you all those things are vanity and vexation of spirit. And if you're striving for fulfillment in life and finding a purpose to it through those things, it's like striving after the wind. You can't get your whole hands on it. But if your interest is pleasing God, you can get your hands on that. Think about it. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. Hope you'll consider it together, standing as we sing.